At 68, I returned to the county fair one last time, and the name my father had spent his entire life building was gone. I didn't cry. I didn't confront anyone. I simply stood there, staring at a sign that carried a stranger's family name where Jonathan Family Crafts had proudly stood for more than 40 years. If you've ever watched something precious disappear while everyone around you acted as if nothing had changed, I hope you'll stay with me until the end. And before we continue, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. Eleanor always says every story finds the people who need it most. My name is Margaret Jonathan. I'm 68 years old, and until 3 years ago, I believed I knew exactly how my family's story would end. Not with wealth. Not with fame. But with our name still hanging above the workshop my father built with his own hands. After my second hospitalization, my cardiologist looked at me with the kind eyes doctors wear when they're trying not to frighten you. He told me it was time to slow down. For the first time in my life, I listened. I stepped away from running the business and handed every responsibility to my only son, Daniel, and his wife, Claire. It wasn't because I wanted to retire. It was because I wanted the business to outlive me. I still visited the workshop every week. The familiar smell of fresh-cut oak greeted me at the door. The same craftsman laughed over morning coffee. The same antique planer my father bought in 1978 still hummed in the corner. Every chair, cabinet, and rocking horse was built with the same care my father had demanded decades earlier. Nothing looked different. So I never imagined anything had changed. What I didn't see wasn't inside the workshop. It was happening in the office. On the invoices. On the website. On shipping labels. On social media. One quiet decision after another. Small enough that no single change felt important. Together, they were rewriting the future of everything my family had built. This year's county fair almost passed without me. The walk from the parking lot to the fairgrounds felt longer than I remembered, and my cane tapped softly against the pavement with every step. I almost turned around twice. Then I smiled to myself. I think my time is running short, I whispered. I just want to see it one more time. From the top of the hill, I spotted our booth immediately. Same corner. Same white canopy. Same handmade rocking chairs displayed out front. For one brief, beautiful second, I felt completely at peace. Then I looked up at the sign. And everything I believed about my family's legacy changed in a single heartbeat. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. The booth hadn't moved. The handcrafted furniture was arranged exactly the way my father had always insisted. The rocking chairs faced the main walkway. The children's toy chest stood near the corner where families naturally gathered. Even the old brass lantern we used every year still hung from the front beam. Everything looked familiar. Except the sign. Harper Heritage Workshop. Not Jonathan Family Crafts. Not even Jonathan Woodworks. Our name had disappeared as completely as if it had never existed. I stood there with one hand resting on my cane, wondering if my heart was racing because of my condition, or because the last 40 years of my life had just been erased with a fresh coat of paint. A cheerful young couple walked into the booth. I've heard great things about Harper Heritage, the woman said. Daniel smiled. Thank you. Our family has been building furniture for generations. Our family. The words landed harder than I expected. He wasn't lying. He had simply changed which family he meant. Claire wrapped a handcrafted cutting board in brown paper while chatting warmly with customers. She looked confident, completely at home. She had always been good with people. Watching her laugh with strangers, no one would have guessed she had once stood beside me learning how to sand walnut by hand because my father believed everyone in the family should understand the craft before selling it. Neither of them noticed me. Or perhaps they did. Perhaps they simply chose not to. An older gentleman studying one of our dining tables looked toward me. His face brightened. Margaret Jonathan? I smiled automatically. Good to see you again, Harold. He shook my hand. I was wondering why I hadn't seen you around these last few years. Before I could answer, Claire stepped forward with perfect politeness. We've made a few changes since Margaret retired. Retired. The word stung. I had stepped back from managing the business. I had never retired from my family. Harold frowned slightly. I always knew this place as Jonathan Family Crafts. Claire's smile never moved. We decided a new name better reflects where the company is headed. Harold nodded slowly, though he didn't look convinced. I suppose times change. Sometimes they have to, Daniel added. I watched the two of them return to helping customers as if nothing unusual had happened. No apology. No explanation. Just another busy Saturday at the county fair. I quietly stepped away from the booth before either of them could see the tears gathering in my eyes. Across the midway, I sat alone on a weathered wooden bench beneath an old maple tree. Children laughed nearby. A bluegrass band played somewhere beyond the livestock barn. Life moved forward exactly as it always had. Only mine seemed to have stopped. As I stared back toward the booth, something else caught my attention. Near the entrance hung a framed photograph. It had always shown my father standing proudly beside the very first Jonathan Family Crafts sign. Now, it was gone. I didn't go back to the booth. Not yet. Instead, I sat beneath that old maple tree and watched people come and go, trying to convince myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe Daniel had only created a second brand. Maybe the Jonathan name was still being used somewhere else. Maybe I had misunderstood. After all, businesses evolve. My father had adapted more than once during his lifetime. When cheap imported furniture flooded the market in the early 1990s, everyone told him to stop making solid oak dining tables. They said handcrafted furniture was dying. He simply smiled and kept building them. The day we chase every trend, he used to tell me, is the day we stop knowing who we are. That sentence stayed with me for nearly 40 years. I wondered if Daniel had ever truly heard it. About 20 minutes later, the crowd around the booth thinned for a moment. I slowly walked back, keeping enough distance that no one would feel uncomfortable. Claire was helping a young couple choose between two rocking chairs. Daniel was speaking with a supplier near the delivery truck. Neither looked toward me. Then something unexpected happened. One of our oldest craftsmen stepped out from behind the booth carrying a stack of wooden display shelves. Frank Wilson. He had worked beside my father for 36 years. He saw me immediately. His face froze. Margaret? I smiled, though it took effort. Hello, Frank. He hurried over and carefully set the shelves on the ground. I didn't know you were coming today. I wanted to surprise everyone. He lowered his eyes. There was an awkward silence I couldn't explain. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest ever since I saw the new sign. Frank, when did they change the name? He looked back toward the booth before answering. About 3 years ago. 3 years. Exactly the same year I stepped away. I swallowed hard. Everyone knew. Frank hesitated. We thought Daniel had talked with you. I slowly shook my head. No. The color drained from his face. I'm so sorry, Margaret. He looked genuinely heartbroken. I remember the day they took down your father's sign. My father's sign. Those 4 words hurt far more than the new name itself. They took it down? I asked quietly. Frank nodded. They said it was time for a fresh start. I stared toward the entrance of the booth. For years, I had believed the old cedar sign was safely stored somewhere after every county fair. I had never imagined it might no longer exist. Frank leaned closer, lowering his voice. I probably shouldn't say this. He paused, making sure no one else was listening. But that wasn't the only thing they changed. Before I could ask what he meant, Daniel turned around. His eyes met mine for the first time that day. The smile on his face disappeared. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Daniel walked toward me with the same calm expression he wore whenever customers had a complaint. Controlled. Professional. Almost rehearsed. "Mom," he said, forcing a smile. "You should have told us you were coming. I wanted to surprise you." His eyes shifted briefly toward Frank, who quietly picked up the display shelves and disappeared behind the booth. Daniel noticed. "So, what have you two been talking about?" "Your grandfather's sign." His smile faded. "We're in the middle of the fair," he replied. "Can we talk about this later?" I looked past him at the booth. "When did you decide our family name wasn't worth keeping?" He let out a slow breath. "It isn't like that." "Then explain it to me." He glanced around at the customers browsing nearby. "I didn't want to have this conversation here." Neither did I. For the first time, there was real tension between us. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just two people standing a few feet apart, realizing they no longer understood each other. Finally, Daniel spoke. The business was struggling. I frowned. It wasn't. It was heading that way. We had loyal customers. They were getting older. So were we. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Mom, the market changed. Younger buyers wanted a different image." "A different image?" "A modern brand." I looked back at the sign. Harper Heritage Workshop. So Jonathan wasn't modern enough? It wasn't personal. I almost laughed. "Daniel, our last name is personal." He didn't answer. Instead, he lowered his voice. "You stopped paying attention to the business side years ago." He wasn't entirely wrong. I had focused on the workshop. The people. The craftsmanship. I trusted him with everything else. "I thought I could," I said quietly. "I thought I was protecting you." The words caught me off guard. Protecting me? You were recovering. You had enough to worry about. So you decided I didn't need to know my own family's name had disappeared? He looked away. Claire stepped outside just then, sensing something was wrong. She didn't interrupt. She simply stood beside Daniel. Not beside me. A small detail. But I noticed it. Daniel folded his arms. "We didn't erase Grandpa." "Then where is his sign?" Silence. "The photograph?" Silence again. "The Jonathan logo?" Still nothing. 3 questions. 3 silences. Sometimes silence answers more honestly than words ever can. A volunteer from the county fair committee walked over carrying a clipboard. "Daniel," she said warmly, "just wanted to remind you your booth has been selected as one of the finalists for this year's Heritage Craft Award." Heritage. The word echoed strangely in my mind. She smiled at me. "You must be Mrs. Harper." Daniel opened his mouth to correct her. He never got the chance. I answered first. "No." I smiled as politely as I could. "I'm Mrs. Jonathan." The volunteer looked confused. Then she glanced from me, to the new sign above the booth. And for the first time that afternoon, someone else realized something didn't make sense. The volunteer excused herself with an awkward smile and continued down the row of exhibitors, but the uncomfortable silence she left behind stayed with all 3 of us. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, this isn't the place." I looked at him for a long moment. "You've said that twice." He didn't answer. Instead, Claire gently touched his arm. "We have customers." Those 3 words told me exactly where I now ranked. Not as Daniel's mother. Not as the woman who had spent 4 decades building the company. Simply, an interruption. I nodded slowly. "You're right." For a split second, relief crossed both of their faces. Then I surprised them. "I won't interrupt your business." I turned and walked away. Neither of them stopped me. Not even with a simple, "Mom, let's talk after the fair." Nothing. As I reached the end of the livestock barn, I heard someone calling my name. Margaret. It was Frank again. He looked around carefully before catching up with me. I've got 15 minutes before my next break. We found 2 empty picnic tables behind the exhibition hall, away from the music and the crowds. Frank sat down heavily. I've been trying to decide for 3 years whether I should tell you. I remained silent. He deserved the chance to speak without feeling rushed. The first thing they changed wasn't the sign. I looked at him. It wasn't. He shook his head. It was the shipping labels. The labels? They stopped saying Jonathan Family Crafts. I felt my stomach tighten. What did they say? Harper Heritage Workshop. I closed my eyes for a second. So the new name didn't start this year. No. Frank's voice grew quieter. It started only a few weeks after you stepped away. A few weeks. Not months. Not years. Weeks. I thought back to that spring. Cardiac rehabilitation. Doctor appointments. Learning how to slow down after living my entire life at full speed. I had been worried about my heart. Someone else had been busy changing my family's identity. Frank reached into the pocket of his work apron. I probably shouldn't have kept this. He unfolded a worn shipping receipt that had been folded so many times the edges were beginning to split. I found it in one of the filing cabinets when we cleaned the office. Across the top, in faded print, I read the words that made my hands tremble. Harper Heritage Workshop. The date printed beneath it was 3 years old. Exactly 11 days after I signed the papers transferring day-to-day management to Daniel. I traced the date with my finger. I never saw this. I know. Frank hesitated before saying something that chilled me far more than the receipt itself. Margaret. They didn't just change the name. They started removing every place your father's name ever appeared. Frank's words followed me long after we left the picnic tables. They started removing every place your father's name ever appeared. At first, I wanted to believe he was mistaken. Maybe he had only noticed a few changes. Maybe Daniel had simply updated old materials that were worn out. But deep inside, I already knew the truth. Removing a family name doesn't happen by accident. It happens one decision at a time. That evening, I drove home instead of stopping by the workshop as I usually did. For the first time in nearly 40 years, I didn't want to see the building. I wasn't ready. Instead, I walked into the small room beside my kitchen where I kept boxes my father had never thrown away. Most people would have called it storage. To me, it was our family's memory. Old photographs. County fair ribbons. Product catalogs from the 1980s. Yellowed newspaper clippings. Receipts written in my father's careful handwriting. I slowly opened the cedar chest he had built for my mother on their 25th anniversary. Everything still smelled faintly of cedar. Beneath a stack of photographs, I found an old county fair program from 22 years earlier. There we were. Jonathan Family Crafts. Best Traditional Woodworking Exhibit. I smiled through tears. Dad had insisted on keeping every fair booklet. One day, he used to say, "These won't be paper. They'll be our history." I suddenly understood what he meant. History only survives if someone protects it. An hour later, my phone rang. Daniel. I stared at his name until the ringing stopped. A few seconds later, another call. Then a text. Asterisk, Mom, can we talk tomorrow? Asterisk. Not. Asterisk, I'm sorry. Asterisk. Not. Asterisk, I should have told you. Asterisk. Just. Asterisk, can we talk tomorrow? Asterisk. I set the phone face down. For once, I wasn't interested in explanations. I wanted facts. The next morning, I drove to the workshop before anyone else arrived. The parking lot was almost empty except for Frank's pickup truck. He was unlocking the side entrance. "You came early," he said quietly. I couldn't sleep. He nodded as though he had expected that answer. Inside, everything looked exactly as it always had. The workbenches. The smell of sawdust. The old radio someone always left tuned to the local country station. If someone had walked in for the first time, they would have believed nothing had changed. Frank led me toward the small display room near the office. "This is where your father kept all the old signs." The wall looked strangely bare. Only a few decorative pieces remained. I frowned. There used to be dozens. There were. "Where are they?" Frank hesitated. "I don't know." He walked to a storage closet and opened the door. Inside sat empty hooks where the original cedar signs had once hung. Someone hadn't simply taken down one sign for the county fair. Someone had been clearing away the past. As I stood there in silence, Frank said something so quietly I almost missed it. "I don't think they wanted people to remember there had ever been another name." Frank stayed with me for another hour that morning. Neither of us talked very much. Some discoveries don't need immediate conversation. They simply settle into your heart, becoming heavier every minute. Before I left the workshop, I walked slowly through every room. The finishing area. The lumber racks. My father's old drafting table. Nothing had changed where the work happened. The hands building the furniture were the same. The values behind the craftsmanship were the same. Only the identity had changed. That realization disturbed me more than I wanted to admit. Someone hadn't tried to build a better company. Someone had tried to build the same company, without the Jonathan name attached to it. As I reached the office door, something caught my eye. The framed certificates that had once lined the hallway were still hanging in neat rows. I stepped closer. Every award was still there. Best Traditional Craftsman. County Heritage Award. Outstanding Family Business. But something felt wrong. I looked again. The older certificates no longer carried our original logo. Someone had carefully replaced the small identification plaques beneath each frame. The awards themselves were untouched. My father's signature was still there. The dates were still there. But the new brass plaques now described every award as belonging to Harper Heritage Workshop instead of Jonathan Family Crafts. They hadn't altered the awards. They had altered the story those awards were telling. I stared at them in disbelief. The awards themselves hadn't changed. History had. Frank noticed where I was looking. "They switched those last winter." "You mean?" "They had new plaques engraved." I reached out and touched the polished brass beneath one frame. The engraving looked perfect. Too perfect. As if the past had always belonged to someone else. I pulled my hand back. "My father accepted this award." Frank nodded. "I know. It wasn't Harper Heritage." "I know." For the first time since arriving, anger quietly replaced sadness. Not loud anger. Not the kind that makes people shout. The kind that makes a person suddenly see everything clearly. This wasn't modernization. This wasn't marketing. This was replacement. Every visitor walking through this hallway would believe Harper Heritage had earned those awards. That simply wasn't true. The craftsmanship deserved respect. The people deserved respect. But history deserved honesty. Before leaving, I stopped at the reception desk. The young receptionist smiled politely. "Good morning. Can I help you? I was wondering if you still keep copies of the original company brochures." She looked uncertain. "I've only worked here about a year." She opened a cabinet and searched through several folders. Finally she frowned. "That's strange." "What is?" "There aren't any." "Any what?" "Anything with the Jonathan name." She looked genuinely surprised. I never realized that. Neither had she. Because if someone joins after history has been rewritten, they don't know anything is missing. As I walked back toward my car, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Daniel. Mom, please let me explain. Claire's parents invested a lot to help us expand. Changing the brand wasn't meant to hurt you. I read the message twice. Then a third time. One sentence stood out above everything else. Claire's parents invested. For the first time. I wasn't asking what had happened. I was beginning to understand why it had happened. I didn't answer Daniel's message. Not because I was angry. Because I had finally realized something my father taught me decades ago. When people are explaining, he used to say, they're telling you their version. When you're looking at records, you're looking at the truth. For 40 years, I had trusted people. Now it was time to trust paperwork. The next morning, I drove somewhere I hadn't visited in years. The office of Richard Ellis. Our family's attorney. Richard had worked with my father long before I ever took over the business. He handled contracts, property records, and every important document connected to Jonathan Family Crafts. When his receptionist saw me, she smiled warmly. Mrs. Jonathan. It's been too long. It has. A few minutes later, Richard walked into the conference room carrying a worn leather folder. His hair had turned completely white since I last saw him, but his handshake felt exactly the same. It's good to see you, Margaret. I wish it were under happier circumstances. He nodded quietly. I suspected that might be why you're here. That caught my attention. You suspected? Richard sat down without answering immediately. Instead, he folded his hands on top of the folder. What would you like to know? I took a deep breath. I want to know when Jonathan Family Crafts stopped being Jonathan Family Crafts. Richard looked at me for several seconds. Then he asked a question I wasn't expecting. When was the last time you personally reviewed the company's business records? I smiled sadly. About 3 years ago. I thought so. He slowly opened the folder. Inside were copies of documents I recognized immediately. Management transfer papers. Annual reports. Trademark renewals. Licensing forms. He placed them neatly across the table. You signed these. I remember. You transferred day-to-day operational authority to Daniel. Yes. But you did not transfer ownership. I frowned. I know that. He nodded. That's why I was surprised when I started seeing new filings. My heart skipped. What kind of filings? Richard carefully slid another document toward me. At the top, in bold letters, I read. Harper Heritage Workshop LLC. The filing date made my stomach tighten. 12 days after I signed the management agreement. It wasn't an accident, I whispered. No. It wasn't gradual. No. It had already been planned. Richard looked directly into my eyes. I can't tell you what they intended. He gently tapped the filing date with his finger. I can only tell you what the records show. 12 days after you stepped aside. The new company was already being registered. Silence filled the room. For months, maybe even years, I had blamed myself. I thought perhaps I had ignored warning signs. Perhaps I had failed to stay involved. Now the timeline told a different story. The paperwork had been prepared almost immediately after I stepped aside. Richard reached into the folder one last time. There is something else. He placed a sealed envelope on the table. Across the front, written in my father's unmistakable handwriting, were just 7 words. For Margaret, if our name is changed. I stared at the envelope without touching it. I had never seen it before. And somehow, I already knew opening it would change everything. For several minutes, I simply looked at the envelope. I traced my father's handwriting with the tip of my finger. He had been gone for almost 9 years. Yet somehow, it felt as though he had reached across time and placed his hand gently on mine. Richard didn't rush me. He quietly slid a letter opener across the table. "When your father left that with me," he said softly, "he gave me very specific instructions." I looked up. "What instructions?" "If the Jonathan name was ever removed from the business, this envelope belonged to you." I swallowed. So he actually imagined this could happen? Richard gave a slow nod. "Your father used to tell me something every time he signed a major document." Richard smiled faintly. "People remember conversations differently. Paper remembers exactly what happened." With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter. The paper had yellowed with age, but every word was still perfectly clear. "My dearest Margaret. Asterisk, if you're reading this, then someone has decided our family name is no longer worth protecting. Asterisk." I stopped. Tears blurred the page. Richard quietly handed me a box of tissues, but neither of us spoke. After a moment, I continued reading. Asterisk, businesses change. Asterisk. Asterisk, buildings are sold. Asterisk. Asterisk, machines wear out. Asterisk. Asterisk, even families sometimes lose their way. Asterisk. Asterisk, but a family name is different. Asterisk. Asterisk, it carries every honest day's work that came before us. Asterisk. Asterisk, once people erase that name, they are not building something new. Asterisk. Asterisk, they are asking the world to forget who built it first. Asterisk. I could almost hear my father's voice. Slow. Calm. Certain. At the bottom of the letter was another paragraph. One I had never expected. Asterisk, that is why I instructed Richard to prepare one final document. Asterisk. Richard quietly reached into the leather folder. He placed another file beside the letter. "This," he said, "was signed the same day your father finalized his estate plan." I opened the document carefully. The heading read, "Declaration of Heritage Protection." I frowned. I've never heard of this. Very few people have. Richard adjusted his glasses. "Your father wasn't trying to control the future. He was trying to protect the history." The document contained one simple provision. If the Jonathan family name was ever voluntarily removed from the business while a direct Jonathan heir was still living, the business could no longer publicly present itself as the continuation of Jonathan family crafts or claim its historical awards, founding date, or family heritage without Margaret's written consent. I looked at Richard in disbelief. So all those awards, they belong to the Jonathan legacy. The county fair displays. They should accurately reflect the business that earned them. I slowly closed the folder. For the first time since I saw the new sign at the fair, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about responsibility. This wasn't about taking something away from Daniel. It was about making sure no one could rewrite 40 years of honest history. Richard leaned forward. "The Heritage Craft Award ceremony is tomorrow afternoon." I looked at him. "I know." He nodded once. "I think it's time the county fair heard the rest of your father's story." The next afternoon, I arrived at the county fair nearly an hour before the Heritage Craft Award ceremony. Just as I had done the day before, I parked farther away than I needed to. Not because I enjoyed the walk. Because I needed the extra time to steady my thoughts. Richard met me near the administration building, carrying the same leather folder. "You ready?" he asked. I smiled faintly. "I don't know." That's an honest answer. Together, we walked toward the exhibition pavilion where the finalists had gathered. Families laughed. Children carried paper cups of fresh lemonade. Blue ribbons fluttered above the livestock barns. For everyone else, it was another beautiful afternoon at the county fair. For me, it felt like the closing chapter of an entire lifetime. Daniel was already there. So was Claire. They stood proudly beside the booth beneath the large sign that read, Harper Heritage Workshop. When Daniel noticed Richard walking beside me, his expression changed immediately. He stepped away from the crowd. "Mom." His voice was quieter than before. "I was hoping we'd have a chance to talk." "I know. I'm sorry this hurt you." I looked at him carefully. It was the first apology he had offered. But something was missing. He had apologized for my feelings, not for his decisions. "I believe you're sorry I'm hurt," I said gently. "I'm still waiting to hear whether you're sorry for what you did." He lowered his eyes. Claire walked over and folded her arms. "We never meant to erase anyone." I nodded. "Then why remove every trace of the Jonathan name?" Neither of them answered. Instead, Claire quietly said. Claire looked at me quietly. "My parents invested nearly $300,000. She hesitated. "They believed the business needed a fresh identity before they were willing to put that kind of money into it." "I know. They wanted a fresh brand." "I know. The old name didn't fit the future." I looked toward the booth. Families were admiring furniture my father had taught me to build. Children were rocking in chairs designed from sketches he drew by hand. Nothing about the craftsmanship had changed. Only the signature. "I've been thinking about that," I said calmly. "You didn't build a new future. You borrowed someone else's past." Before either of them could respond, the announcer's voice echoed across the pavilion. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for this year's Heritage Craft Award presentation." People gathered around the stage. The judges took their seats. One by one, the finalists were introduced. When the announcer smiled toward Daniel's booth, my heart became perfectly still. "Our next finalist," she said proudly, "Harper Heritage Workshop, continuing a family tradition that began more than 40 years ago." Richard quietly opened his leather folder. Without a single word, he handed one document to the chair of the judging committee. The woman accepted it politely, expecting nothing unusual. She glanced at the first page. Then the second. Her smile slowly disappeared. She looked from the document to the booth, then toward me. For the second time in 2 days. Someone realized the story on that sign wasn't the whole story. The chair of the judging committee read the first page twice. Then she quietly leaned toward the fair director sitting beside her. Within seconds, the two of them were reviewing Richard's documents together. The announcer paused. The audience noticed. A crowd that had been chatting only moments earlier slowly grew silent. Daniel looked from the stage to Richard. Then to me. His confidence began to fade. Claire whispered something to him, but he didn't respond. Finally, the fair director stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen." He smiled politely, though his voice carried a seriousness that hadn't been there before. "We're going to take a brief pause while we verify some historical documentation regarding one of today's finalists." A murmur spread through the pavilion. No one understood what was happening. Richard remained perfectly still beside me. He had spent his career believing facts should speak louder than arguments. Today, they finally would. About 10 minutes later, the judging committee returned. The chairwoman approached the microphone. "We've reviewed documents provided by legal counsel representing the Jonathan family." She glanced toward Daniel before continuing. "The committee has determined that several historical references presented with Harper Heritage Workshop require clarification. No accusations. No public embarrassment. Just careful words supported by verified records." She continued. "The awards earned over the past 4 decades were presented to Jonathan Family Crafts." She held up one of the original county fair programs Richard had provided. "This documentation confirms the historical record." The audience listened quietly. Many of the older visitors nodded. Some of them remembered my father. Some remembered me. The chairwoman looked toward Daniel. "Your current business is welcome to compete on its own accomplishments." She smiled kindly. "But the Heritage Craft Award recognizes documented history." She paused. and history belongs to those who built it. The pavilion became completely still. Then something happened I never expected. Daniel walked away from the booth. Not toward the stage. Toward me. He stopped only a few feet away. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly said, "I thought changing the name would help us grow." "I know. I never thought about what it would cost." I looked at my son. Not as a businessman. Not as the person who had hurt me. Simply as the little boy who once swept sawdust from my father's workshop floor every Saturday morning. "You weren't wrong for wanting the business to grow." His eyes filled with regret. "You were wrong for believing it had to forget where it came from." He lowered his head. Daniel looked at the old county fair program still resting in the committee chair's hands. He stared at my father's photograph printed beside the words Jonathan Family Crafts. His shoulders slowly dropped. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "I'm sorry, Mom." This time. There were no excuses. No marketing. No investors. No explanations. Only those two words. The committee announced that the Heritage Craft Award would be postponed until the historical records could be updated to accurately reflect the business that had earned them over the years. As the crowd slowly dispersed, no one applauded. No one argued. People simply accepted the truth. And for the first time since I walked into the county fair, I felt something inside me become peaceful again. Not because I had one, but because my father's name had finally been spoken, exactly where it belonged. A week after the county fair, I received a phone call from the fair committee. The historical records had been corrected. Every past Heritage Craft Award would once again list the business that had actually earned it. Jonathan Family Crafts. Not because someone wanted to embarrass Daniel. Not because anyone wanted to punish Harper Heritage Workshop. Simply because history deserves to be truthful. A few days later, Daniel came to my house alone. No lawyers. No investors. No Claire. Just my son. He stood on my front porch holding something wrapped in an old quilt. "I found this in the storage building," he said quietly. "I think it belongs with you." When I unfolded the quilt, I stopped breathing for a moment. It was my father's original cedar sign. The same one he had carved by hand more than 40 years earlier. The edges were worn. The finish had faded. But the words were still there. Jonathan Family Crafts. Daniel looked down at the porch floor. I never threw it away. I ran my fingers across the carved letters. Then why hide it? He took a long breath before answering. Because every time I looked at it, I felt like I could never live up to Grandpa. For the first time, I truly understood him. This had never been about hating our family. It had been about living under the weight of a family name he thought he could never honor. I gently placed the sign across my lap. "Daniel. You were never supposed to become your grandfather." He looked at me. "You were only supposed to become the best version of yourself." His eyes filled with tears. I thought changing the name would finally let people see what I built. I smiled sadly. They already could. They just never asked you to erase where it began. Over the next several months, we made a decision together. Daniel chose to keep Harper Heritage Workshop as the name of the company he would lead. I didn't ask him to change it back. That wasn't the point anymore. What mattered was that no one would ever again mistake it for the company my father built. From that day forward, our history and his future each had their rightful place. Daniel had every right to build something for his own generation. But every award, every historical display, every county fair record, and every piece of our family's history would once again carry its rightful name. Jonathan Family Crafts. Not as a brand. As a legacy. The old cedar sign now hangs above the fireplace in my home. Every time my grandchildren visit, they ask about the scratches, the faded paint, and the tiny crack running through one corner. I tell them those marks aren't flaws. They're proof that something has survived. And maybe that's what a legacy really is. Not a business. Not a logo. Not even a family name. A legacy is the truth that refuses to disappear, even after the people who built it are gone. I'm Eleanor Brooks. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If Margaret had stayed silent after seeing that news sign at the county fair, do you think she would have been protecting her family, or allowing her family's history to disappear? And if you had been in Daniel's position, would you have changed the family name to grow the business, or found another way to honor both the future and the past? I'd truly love to read your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, take good care of yourself, and never underestimate the value of the name you leave behind.